Let's discuss the use of terracing on urban plots or around your homestead. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. Terracing is an excellent way to get maximum utilization of land while reducing erosion and improving access. Have you seen the large house on a hill with a long sloped backyard and noticed that while the grass established well, over time you see patching, you see areas where the ground has kind of washed away. Even a 1 to 3 slope, that means for every 1 foot of vertical rise, there is 3 foot of run. While it's an erosion stable slope, you're still going to have some kind of erosion or run out. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. First off, most lawns are maintained by equipment. So, the landscaper you hired is going to go jump on their zero turn and they're going to race around on your property. And over time, you're going to start getting some patches of erosion. You get patches of erosion, they just seed them the next year, and then you have grass again temporarily, and then you have erosion again. Why does this happen? Well, no matter what the slope is, the more elevation you have on a hill, especially in a temperate climate, the more likely you're going to have what's called a water lens in the property. Now, my property has a number of springs. From my house elevation to the highest hill that's nearby is a 50-foot elevation. From the top of my property to the bottom of my property is a 125-foot elevation. So I'm 50 foot below grade, and then the back of my property is 125 foot below. So it's a total of 175 feet from the ridge line that's nearby, which means there is definitely water lenses everywhere. After a rain event, my driveway will have weeping. So basically little springs in the driveway. Now this isn't running water, it's just wet spots. And in the yard, it'll happen the same. Now, before I implemented terracing, what would happen is these wet spots would slowly erode over time. Now, this happens on all hills and slopes, especially if you're maintaining them in grass. It's not as big of a problem if you have trees, but as those trees age, you get different problems. Like, for example, the ground getting soft and a giant tree fall over. So terracing is a useful solution because what it does is intermittently breaks the slope with a level platform that can be planted out in a more stable and sustainable way. So, for example, Sepp Holzer talks about in Permaculture, his home was literally on a mountain, but in his book, he talks about the use of terracing, even micro terraces, in order to provide space to plant trees, but also means to help animals navigate across the property. That's another challenge that happens when you got hills and slopes. Let's say you've got 4 or 5 cattle. You're not a cattle rancher. You're not a cowboy, but these cattle are off on these fields. You're going to start noticing these tracks in the field where water will run and the animals will tend to travel. If you terrace off that space, you're going to provide more stable walking areas for animals. You're going to provide small grazing paddocks, and you're going to have a little bit more control over the land where you can actually exclude animals off of the slopes while they get established in trees. So Sepp Holzer actually uses terraces for, again, tree planting areas to create microclimates, to create access points and traveling means across a uneven terrain. And again, as I was describing, your terraces help slow and spread water, which prevents erosion. Now, in the case of my property, there are several springs on the property. I have created a terrace at each spring level. So this is very important. You can't just go willy-nilly start terracing out a property. You need to know, where do you already have water seepage? Where do you have areas of moisture and impaction? Where do you have access points on or off the property? Where do you have contours already? See, a contour that's been around for 100 years, if you build a terrace aligned with that contour, it tends to be more stable because there's likely rock structure underground. But in my case, I built the terraces slightly below each of the spring points and then created a basin under that spring point. So normally what happens on a large slope Imagine the house on the hill, and you have the beautiful rolling hills, where each point where there is moisture in the sides of the hill due to a water lens, and this is some basic hydrology that we can discuss in detail if you like on another podcast, but each point where that water that's underground is saturating the ground and peeking right out at the edge of the slope, those areas are actually going to be susceptible to erosion. Now, they're going to be more susceptible to erosion as the water comes out of the hill and then starts gaining speed and energy rolling down the hill itself. So by placing a terrace slightly below the spring point and actually adding a basin, you're now taking the spring water and taking all the energy out of it, and then having yourself an opportunity, because you've now created a level place, to start growing plants that can use up that moisture. The best way to handle slopes is not to put grass on them. The best way to handle slopes is either through a silvopasture method, where you have contouring ridges, even if they're small micro terraces or micro swales, but planted out in trees, because trees are going to have a much deeper root system. Trees are also going to take this moisture, if there is a water lens, and absorb it into carbon sequestration, or otherwise pump it into the atmosphere through evaporation. But we also want to make sure that our access points are there so that we can get across the land, or our animals can get across the land. And so terracing slightly below the spring point gives you an opportunity to divert water so that you don't have a soggy bench. So these terraces, if they're too wet, they can actually collapse. Now, building terraces is not an easy thing to do. When we did the property here, we had to bring out a 25-ton excavator in order to compact these terraces down so that they would support a 70,000-pound dump truck, so that they could actually bring in additional fill and soil. So it can be a construction project. Now, we've gone into details about that in the land management program, but the shortcut is to make sure you hire qualified professionals. So you can hand dig a terrace by hand, a few feet wide, 2 or 3 feet wide. It gives you a walking path for access. Maybe you could ride a riding lawnmower down it. But if you're going to produce something wide enough for a vehicle, that needs to be 12 feet wide, properly compacted, sloped the right way to prevent channeling or other types of erosion, and be placed on the slope at the appropriate location. Now, I can look at pictures and tell you what we're looking at as far as the erosions and the washouts. And there are various different types of erosions that tell you different things about the property. But the key is your terracing gives you a place to plant. It gives you a means of controlling the water flow. It gives you an opportunity to get better use of your property because you can safely traverse the property. It gives you the opportunity for tree systems, which create other types of outputs, such as firewood, or if you're into basketry, you can have willows, for example. That spring point where it comes out is a great place for willows. Willows will suck up that moisture and really thrive in that environment. But again, terraces are very powerful. If you have a detention pond, for example, terracing the side of your detention pond with level terraces or level sills gives you an opportunity to plant in different microclimates. So the terrace that's down near the water level will actually be very moist. You can grow cattail there. The next terrace up will be moist only in the wet season, and that's great for willows. And then up the slope a little bit more, you'll have different levels of moisture that would be useful for fruit trees, for timber trees, and other growing opportunities. So I'm really excited about terraces. Now, very often your city zoning is going to want this giant 1-to-3 slope, because when you cut terraces, you're going to end up with, you could still have the 1-to-3 slope, but you could end up with a 1-to-2 slope, which is also stable. But again, it looks unusual to the untrained and uninformed eye. So you do want your terraces to be planted out as soon as possible. You want to make sure your terraces have design features such as edging. So, for example, I saw a beautiful terrace that actually had, on the channel side, it had water-tolerant plants like taro. On the outside, where it's a little bit drier, it had wildflowers. And then downslope, it had a variety of small shrub-like trees. So It actually gave it a wonderful view, but they were able to put in a couple lines of what would be vetiver grass, deep-rooted grass, clumping deep-rooted grass, that made it look much more ornamental than what I would prefer, kind of a wilderness look. But ultimately, it was very appealing in that environment. Does it take away this lawn? Does it take away jobs from landscapers? Well, yes and no. But it ultimately gives you better access, better erosion management, greater stability, and a wonderful and prosperous homestead. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead, where we talk about ideas and concepts for managing your small farm, homestead, or estate. We've been talking about the value and use of terracing. And we can go into great detail about terracing. I can show you some practical examples, but you can turn a hilly, unusable location into a very enjoyable space through the use of terracing. You can solve a lot of erosion problems through terracing. And as Sepp Holzer talks about, you can actually create areas for planting, microclimates, and access for animals with the use of terracing. If you've got specific questions for your property, contact me at www.prosperityhomestead.org. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. Thanks for listening.